In June of the year 1215, in a meadow beside the river Thames called Runnymede, a defeated and furious king set his seal to a document he had no intention of honoring. His name was John, King of England, and he had lost the war in France. He had bled his barons dry with arbitrary taxes and arbitrary justice for 16 years until the most powerful men in his kingdom rose against him in armed revolt and took London. He had quarreled so bitterly with the Pope that the whole of England had been placed under interdiction, the churches closed, the dead buried in unconsecrated ground, and now cornered, with an army he could not defeat encamped against him. He agreed to terms. The terms were written down on a sheet of parchment, and the king pressed his seal into wax. He was lying. Within 10 weeks, he had written to Rome, and the Pope Innocent III obligingly declared the whole agreement null and void, illegal, unjust, shameful. And he absolved the king of any duty to keep the word he had never meant to keep. The charter was dead almost before the wax had cooled. Civil war resumed, and the next year John died of dysentery, and the document he had sealed lay legally void. A failed peace treaty between a faithless king and a self-interested aristocracy. And yet, it did not stay dead. That parchment, reissued, revised, confirmed, and reconfirmed dozens of times across the centuries that followed, outlived its own annulment, and outlived the feudal world that made it, and became something its drafters would not have recognized and honestly might not have wanted. 400 years later, an English judge would reach back to one of its clauses and read into it a meaning its authors had never imagined. And the American colonists would read that judge. And by the time Thomas Jefferson sat down in Philadelphia, the document a lying king sealed in a wet meadow had become a foundation stone of the proposition that even the highest power on earth is bound by a law it did not make and cannot suspend at its own pleasure. Here's the strange and important thing about the road we have been walking. The things that endure are rarely the things their makers intended. King John meant to buy time. He bought, without knowing it, 800 years of the idea that the king is under the law. This is episode 4, and this is the episode where the inheritance stops being philosophy and starts becoming politics. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 4 of the series, Self-Evident, The Road to 1776. And today, Higher Law, Medieval Foundations. This episode corresponds to Article 4 of our written series, published this past Sunday on our Substack page. And it is a milestone episode because it closes the first arc of this series. Over the past 3 weeks, we have gathered the inheritance from its ancient sources. Athens gave us reason and the mixed constitution. Jerusalem gave us the covenant and the conviction that even kings stand under a higher law. Rome gave us natural law and the hard knowledge of how a republic dies. And the House of Wisdom preserved that whole philosophical inheritance through the centuries when the Latin West had lost it, and handed it back transformed and with commentary. Today, we watch the medieval world take that recovered inheritance and forge it into something new, into the working doctrines of constitutional government. And then, at the end of the hour, we will stand on the summit of this first stage of the road and look back across the entire distance we have traveled, because the founders did not merely just read these things. They were formed by them. As always, the podcast expands on the themes of the article, brings in additional primary sources, and addresses complexities the written format cannot fully explore. So, let us begin.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions Podcast. Here we ask a simple question of the history and the actions that have shaped our lives.
Did this leave us more free or more governed? because what we do not know can be used to govern us.
And what we choose to ignore always will.
Let's go back to that meadow because we left a great deal on the table. The honest historian has to begin by saying what the Magna Carta was not. It was not a charter of liberty in any sense Jefferson would have meant. It was a peace treaty between a king and an aristocracy. And most of its 63 clauses are concerned with matters that could not be more remote from the rights of man. Feudal inheritance dues, the removal of fish weirs from the Thames, the treatment of Welsh and Scottish hostages, and the debts owed to moneylenders. The barons who forced it on John were not Democrats and were not friends of the common Englishman. They were a propertied warrior class protecting their own privileges against a king who had trampled them. If you went to Runnymede in 1215 looking for the seed of the Declaration of Independence, you would have found a tax dispute among armed aristocrats. And yet, buried in that feudal settlement, in the 39th of its 63 clauses, was a sentence. Strip away the medieval Latin and the feudal context, and here's what it says. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled or destroyed in any way, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. Listen to what that sentence does. It says there is something the king may not do, not something he ought not do as a matter of conscience or good kingship, but something he may not do as a matter of law. He may not simply seize a free man. He may not simply take his property. He may not destroy him by royal pleasure or royal suspicion or royal need. He may proceed against him only one of two ways: by the judgment of his peers or by the settled, known law of the land. The king's will is not enough. There must be law. The barons who wrote that clause were thinking about themselves, about their own persons and their own estates, protected from a predatory king. They were not thinking about you, but they had written down a principle whose logic ran far past anything they intended, and that is the recurring theme and the recurring miracle of this whole story. Once a principle is written into the world, it is available to be read by people the authors never imagined, and carried to conclusions the authors never dared. Clause 39 protected a few hundred barons in 1215. By the time it had passed through the hands of 17th century lawyers, it protected every subject of the crown. And by the time it reached Philadelphia, it had become due process of law. The principle written into the 5th and 14th Amendments of the American Constitution that no person may be deprived of life, liberty, or property without it. Now I want to give you the man who took the principle latent in that meadow and stated it into a doctrine of law. His name was Henry de Bracton, a royal judge of the 13th century. His great treatise on the laws and customs of England became one of the foundational texts of the entire common law tradition. And here's the remarkable thing about Bracton. He was no revolutionary. He served the crown. He was the king's own judge, and yet he wrote a single sentence that the kings of England would spend the next 400 years trying to escape. The king, Bracton wrote, ought not to be under any man, but he ought to be under God and under the law, because the law is what makes him a king. Bracton is not saying the king answers to some other man who might command him, a more powerful baron, a pope, a rival. That would only move the crown from one head to another. It would relocate tyranny, not end it. He is saying something far more durable. He is saying that above the king and above every man stands a law that no human being enacted and no human being may repeal. The king does not make that law. The king is made by it. Take the law away, and the crown is nothing but a band of metal worn by the strongest brigand in the realm. It is the law that turns the brigand into a king. And the thing that constituted by the law cannot stand without the law, any more than a house can stand without its own foundation. This is the deepest principle of the entire medieval contribution, and is the simplest to state and the hardest for power to ever accept. The ruler is not the source of the law. He is its servant. And there's a piece of this we have to slow down for, because the modern world has very nearly lost it. And without it, the rest does not make much sense. To the medieval legal mind, law was not primarily legislation. It was not, first and foremost, a command issued by a sovereign will to be obeyed simply because the sovereign issued it. Law was closer to something discovered. A body of right reason and ancient custom grounded into the nature of things and the long practice of the community, which the judge and the lawyer uncovered rather than invented. The common law of England was understood as immemorial custom, refined case by case, discovered the way a mathematician discovers a theorem rather than authored the way a poet authors a verse. And the consequence of that view is enormous. Follow it carefully. If law is simply made by the sovereign's will, then whatever the sovereign wills is law, and the only check on tyranny is the sovereign's own conscience, which is to say, no check at all. But if law is discovered, if it exists independently of any ruler's command, and the ruler's enactments are valid only insofar as they conform to it, then there is a standard above the ruler. There is something by which his commands can be measured, and if they fail the measure, they are found wanting. The entire edifice of constitutionalism rests on exactly this foundation. A constitution is, at the very bottom, a single audacious claim that some law stands above the lawmaker. Hold on to that, because in the 17th century, when an English judge named Sir Edward Coke stands up in front of King James I and tells him that common law will control even the acts of Parliament when they violate right reason, he is not inventing a new doctrine. He is reaching back through Bracton to a medieval inheritance that had never entirely been lost. That confrontation belongs to a later arc of this series. What matters tonight is the foundation was laid here in the medieval centuries. The law is not the king's, and the king is not above the law. In April of 1963, in a narrow cell in the city jail of Birmingham, Alabama, a Baptist minister was writing in the margins of a newspaper and on scraps of paper smuggled into him, because the jailers would not give him proper writing materials. He had been arrested for marching without a permit. A group of white clergymen had published an open letter calling his protest unwise and untimely, the work of an outside agitator who ought to wait and let the courts do their work. And Martin Luther King Jr. was writing his answer. He needed to explain how he could ask people to obey some laws and break others, how that was not lawlessness, but the opposite. And to do it, he reached back 700 years and reached for a name. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, King wrote, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. A man has not only a legal, but a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. And he cited, as his authority, a 13th century Dominican friar. The line runs straight from the Dominican cell to the jail cell. 7 centuries, one principle, and let me show you where it came from. Thomas Aquinas is the central figure of this episode, and in a real sense, he is the central figure of the entire natural law tradition that runs through this whole series. He was a Dominican friar, born around 1225 to a noble family in the Kingdom of Sicily. Against his family's furious objection, they wanted him in a respectable, powerful abbacy, not wandering as a mendicant preacher in a new and suspect order. He joined the Dominicans and gave his life to a single enormous project: the reconciliation of faith and reason. He studied at Paris and Cologne. He taught at the greatest universities of Christendom, and he produced in his Summa Theologica one of the most ambitious intellectual structures ever attempted by a single human mind. He died in 1274, not yet 50, and left it unfinished. Within 50 years, the church had canonized him. Within centuries, he had become its central theologian. And I want to pause on something we established last week, because Aquinas is the living proof of it. Aquinas could write what he wrote only because the philosophical inheritance of Athens had been returned to the Latin West. And it had been returned, as we trace in episode 3, largely through the Islamic transmission. Aquinas read his Aristotle in Latin translations made from the Arabic. He engaged so consistently with the great philosopher of Cordoba, Ibn Rushd, Averroes the commentator, that the engagement runs through the whole of his mature work. When Aquinas argued against Averroes, he was not dismissing him. He was wrestling with the most formidable Aristotelian of the previous century, the man whose reading of the text he had to answer before he could do his own work. The synthesis Aquinas built of Athens and Jerusalem and Rome braided into one was constructed quite literally on books that Muslim and Jewish scholars had preserved and translated and illuminated when Christian Europe could not. Aquinas is the transmission of the last week made flesh. Hold that, because it is the whole argument of the series in a single man. Now to the architecture itself. The heart of Aquinas' treatise on law is a hierarchy of 4 kinds of law, descending from the mind of God to the statutes of men, and you can hold the whole structure in your head if you take it one step at a time. At the top is the eternal law, the rational order by which God governs all of creation, the divine wisdom directing all things to their proper ends. No creature grasps it in full. It is the law as it exists in the mind of God. Second is natural law. And this is the hinge on which the entire tradition turns, so listen closely. The natural law is the eternal law as it is accessible to human reason. Rational creatures, Aquinas said, participate in the eternal law in a special way. We can apprehend, by the light of reason alone, the basic principles of right action. The very first precept of natural law is simply this: the good is to be done and pursued, and evil avoided. And from that flow the deep inclinations to preserve life, to live in a society, to seek truth, and to act according to reason. And here's the part that matters most for the road to 1776. The natural law is universal, and it is knowable. It is not confined to those who have received special revelation. A pagan, a Muslim, a man who had never once heard the gospel, any rational being whatsoever can in principle discern its precepts, because reason itself is the faculty by which it is known. That is the doctrine Cicero had articulated in Rome. It is the doctrine Jefferson would echo 5 centuries after Aquinas when he grounded the Declaration in the laws of nature and of nature's God. A law written into the nature of things, accessible to every rational mind, binding on every human being, prior to and above every government. That idea has a pedigree, and Aquinas is the central link to it. Third is human law, the positive law, the actual statutes and ordinances that human authorities enact to govern particular communities. And here Aquinas drew the conclusion that gives this episode its title. Human law derives its whole force from the natural law. A human enactment that conforms to the natural law and serves the common good is genuine law, binding in conscience. But a human enactment that contradicts the natural law is something else entirely. And the fourth law is divine law. The law revealed in Scripture, given because the highest end of the human person exceeds what reason alone can reach, and because human judgment is too uncertain to be left without guidance on the deepest things. The divine law supplements the natural, it does not contradict it. And now we arrive at the sentence that would echo through 7 centuries, all the way to that jail cell in Birmingham. From this architecture, Aquinas drew a doctrine that can be stated in 5 Latin words. Lex injusta non est lex. An unjust law is not a law. A human enactment that exceeds the authority of the lawgiver, or that is contrary to the common good, or that violates the natural law, is, in Aquinas' own words, no longer a law, but a perversion of law. And it does not bind the conscience. This is among the most consequential sentences in the entire history of political thought. And we have to render it honestly because it is more carefully hedged than people remember. And the honesty is the whole point of how this series reads its sources. Aquinas did not hand later generations a blank check for disobedience. He drew a careful distinction. There are laws that are unjust because they are merely contrary to human good, burdensome, unequal, tilted toward the ruler's private benefit rather than the common good. Those laws, he said, do not bind the conscience as a matter of strict justice. And yet a man may still be obliged to obey them, to avoid scandal or public disorder, because the peace of the community is itself a real good. And then there is a second kind. Laws that are unjust because they command what is positively sinful, what God forbids. Those laws, Aquinas said, must never be obeyed. Here one must obey God rather than men. So the principle is real, and it is radical, but it is disciplined. It is not the modern claim that every individual may disobey whatever law happens to offend his private conscience. It is something far more careful and far more durable. That there exists an objective standard, accessible to reason, standing above all human enactment, a standard against which any human law can be measured, and by which it can be found to be no true law at all. That standard does not dissolve the duty to keep public order lightly, but it does establish against every theory of unlimited sovereignty ever devised that the lawgiver is not the final word. And that is why, 700 years later, a minister in a Birmingham jail could reach for Aquinas by name to explain why a man has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to disobey an unjust law. The line runs straight from the Dominican cell to the jail cell, and it runs through the conviction that law answers to something higher than power. And what of that tyrant himself? Not merely his unjust statute, but of his unjust rule. Here too Aquinas spoke, and here too I have to read him with care, because the libertarian temptation is to enlist him as a clean, ringing theorist of the right of revolution, and he was not quite that. Aquinas held that government directed to the common good is legitimate, and that a government directed to the private good of the ruler is a perversion, tyranny, the worst of all corrupt forms. He held that the tyrant, by betraying the very end for which his authority exists, forfeits his claim to obedience. But Aquinas was deeply, soberly wary of the cure being far worse than the disease. Private, unauthorized rebellion, sedition, he condemned for two reasons. One, it is apt to fail and bring down even greater suffering on the people, and because the man who appoints himself the avenger of the public is all too likely to become a tyrant in his own term. So Aquinas' preferred remedies were institutional. The community that has the authority to set up a king has the authority to restrain or depose a king who turns tyrant. Resistance, where it is genuinely justified, belongs to public authority, to the community acting through its proper channels, not to a private assassin with a knife and a grievance. It is a careful, conservative, profoundly responsible doctrine. And it is the seed of everything that follows, because the Calvinist resistance theorists of the 16th century would take Aquinas' hedged and cautious account and sharpen it into a full-blown theory of lawful resistance by lesser magistrates. And Locke would inherit that transformed doctrine and give it its most famous form: the right of the people to alter or abolish a government that has become destructive of its ends. And Jefferson would write that very phrase into the Declaration of Independence. The chain begins here, with the 13th century friar who would have been horrified by the guillotine, but who established the premise from which the entire structure was raised: that authority is a trust held for the common good, then that the ruler who betrays the trust has broken the bond that obliged obedience. If Aquinas gave the tradition its natural law spine, it was a physician and a political theorist from Padua named Marsilius who pushed hardest and earliest toward a principle we now call popular sovereignty. His book, The Defender of the Peace, appeared in 1324, and it was radical enough that when his authorship became known, he had to flee for his life to the protection of the Holy Roman Emperor. Marsilius wrote in the middle of a long and bitter war between the emperor and the papacy over the boundaries of secular and spiritual power. And his immediate purpose was narrow: to deny the Pope any coercive authority in worldly affairs. But in the course of that argument, he advanced a theory of political authority that reached far past the quarrel that occasioned it. The legitimate source of law, Marsilius argued, is the human legislator, and that the legislator is the whole body of the citizens, or its weightier part. Law derives its authority not from the wisdom of the ruler, and not from any sanction descending from heaven, but from the consent of the community that is to live under it. The ruler holds his office from the community and is accountable to it. And a ruler who exceeds his commission may be corrected or removed by the very authority that established him. This is a startling thing to find in 1324, 400 years before the American founders located the source of all legitimate authority in we the people. A Paduan physician had located the source of legitimate law in the whole body of the citizens. But honesty requires a complication here. Marsilius was not a clean proto-libertarian, and his doctrine cuts in more than one direction at once. His central aim was to subordinate the church entirely to the secular power, and that the concentrated state authority he built up to accomplish that subordination can be read just as easily as a forerunner of the all-powerful modern state as of popular self-government. That phrase, the weightier part of the citizens, is notoriously elastic, and Marsilius did not mean anything like universal suffrage by it. And once his legislator had spoken, it could authorize a very great deal of coercion. The same logic that makes the community the source of law can make the community's actments unlimited if nothing stands above them. Marsilius is the first clear reminder on this road of a lesson the series will have grim occasion to revisit when we reach 1789 and the road that ran from the rights of man to the terror. Popular sovereignty and individual liberty are not the same thing. A doctrine that locates all authority in the people can become a doctrine of unlimited authority just as readily as it can become a doctrine of freedom. The will of the people, fully and fairly expressed, has more than once been the very instrument by which liberty was destroyed. One more medieval contribution deserves its moment, though it runs quietly beneath much of what we have already said. The Canon Lawyers of the medieval church, the scholars who systematized the church's own law, beginning with a great compilation called Decretum around the year 1140, developed almost as a byproduct of working out how authority operated inside the institutions of the church, a set of principles that turned out to be extraordinarily fertile for secular constitutional thought. Chief among them was a maxim drawn originally from a Roman private law and given vast new life in the hands of canonists. What touches all must be approved by all. It began as a narrow technical rule about the consent of co-guardians over a ward. It became, in the canonists' hands, a sweeping principle of representation and consent, that those who are bound by a decision have a right to a voice in the making of it. The canon lawyers worked out detailed theories of corporation, of representation, of how a community acts through its head while still retaining an authority that the head does not exhaust and cannot swallow, and that the conditions under the members of a corporation might lawfully act against a head who had failed in his office. They developed all of this for the governance of dioceses and monasteries and the universal church. But it did not stay in the church. It flowed outward to the secular world, and the idea that legitimate authority requires consent, representation, and accountability was worked out in patient technical detail by men in clerical robes long before it ever animated a parliament. And I want you to notice what that means for the story this series is telling. The genealogy of liberty does not only run through the figures we put on pedestals, it also runs through obscure canon lawyers, solving narrow problems about the governance of religious corporations whose technical solutions became, generations later and in another domain entirely, the very grammar of constitutional government. The thread is woven from far more fibers than the known and named heroes alone. And now I owe you a reckoning, because a history that flattered the Middle Ages into some golden age of liberty would forfeit any trust this series depends on. And we have named the failures of every civilization we have visited, so we will not spare this one. The medieval world that produced Bracton and Aquinas and Marsilius was also a world of serfdom, in which a great majority of human beings were bound to the land and to the will of a lord. It was a world of savage religious persecution. It launched the Crusades with their massacres of Muslims and Jews and Eastern Christians alike. It built the machinery of the Inquisition. It expelled the Jews from England in 1290 and from one kingdom after another in the centuries that followed. And it subjected those who remained to humiliation and plunder and periodic slaughter. The very same Magna Carta, whose 39th clause we have been celebrating, contains other clauses that regulate the debts owed to Jewish moneylenders in terms that treated an entire people as the king's property. And the sharpest tension sits at the exact center of this episode. Thomas Aquinas, the man who taught that natural law is universal, accessible to every rational being regardless of creed, the man who gave the West its most powerful argument that there exists a moral order binding on all persons and discoverable by all reason, that same Aquinas also held that obstinate heretics, after due warning, might rightly be handed over to the secular authority to be put to death. The man who built the doctrine of universal natural law also endorsed the killing of those who, having once professed the faith, persisted in error about it. This is not a contradiction that can be dissolved with a sympathetic loss, and this series will not try to dissolve it. It must be named plainly. The doctrine of universal natural law and the practice of lethal religious coercion coexisted in the very same mind, and that coexistence is by its nature a scandal to the doctrine. But naming the scandal is not the same as discarding the contribution. And here's the standard this series has applied from the very first episode, and we will go on applying. And I want to say it as clearly as I can because the most important application of it is still ahead of us. Genuine philosophical achievement and grave moral failure can inhabit the same person and the same civilization at the same time. Intellectual honesty requires us to hold both in view at once without letting either erase the other. The principle that even the king stands under the law was real, and it was medieval scholars who forged it. The principle that an unjust law is no law was real, and it was Aquinas gave it its enduring form. That the men who articulated these principles did not extend them to the serf or the heretic or the Jewish person is not a reason to throw the principles away. It is a reason to carry them further than their authors dared, which is exactly what later generations would do. And it is exactly the test we will have to apply with the same honesty when this series reaches the founders themselves and lays open the contradiction between the doctrine of human equality and the practice of human slavery. We are rehearsing now on Aquinas the honesty we will owe to Jefferson. And before I close, the honest case against everything I told you, stated at full strength as the way this series always does. There are 3 serious objections to the accounts in this episode, and each one has able defenders. The first is the charge of anachronism, and it is the most formidable of the 3. It says the entire episode commits the cardinal sin of what historians call Whig history, reading the present backward into the past. The medieval liberties of the Magna Carta, the critic argues, were nothing like modern liberty. They were specific, particular, feudal privileges belonging to a specific corporate bodies. The barons at Runnymede were not defending the rights of man. They were defending the inheritance customs and tax exemptions of a warrior aristocracy. To read Clause 39 as a charter of universal due process is to pour into a feudal document a meaning and only acquired centuries later, in the hands of 17th century lawyers with their own political fight to win. And the same charge applies to the whole hour. Aquinas was a medieval theologian working out problems internal to scholastic Christianity, not a forerunner of liberalism. And to draft him into the genealogy of 1776 is to kidnap him from his own century. Okay. The objection is real force, and the candid answer concedes a great deal of it. The barons were not liberals. Magna Carta in 1215 was a feudal settlement, and Clause 39 meant less in its own moment than it would later be made to mean. Much of the history I've told you tonight is, frankly, the history of how later generations read the medieval inheritance, what they found in it, what they built out of it. But the concession is not fatal for 2 reasons. First, the latter reading was not a fabrication imposed on dead material. It was the development of something genuinely there. Clause 39 really does say that the king may not proceed against a free man except by lawful judgment or the law of the land. That principle, however narrow its first application, is the actual seed from which the broader doctrine grew. Coke did not conjure due process out of nothing. He generalized a principle that was truly present in the text. And second, and this cuts deeper, the charge of anachronism cuts against the critic too. To insist an idea can only ever mean what the authors consciously intended is itself a contestable theory of meaning. Ideas have logical implications their authors do not foresee. The principle that a king is under the law has a logic that runs straight past the barons who first invoked it for their own narrow benefit, and the centuries-long working out that the logic is not a distortion of the inheritance. It is a fulfillment. The second objection is a theological dependence. It says the medieval contribution rests fatally on premises no longer widely shared. Aquinas' natural law is the eternal law of a particular God, noble because a rational creator built rationality into the universe and the human mind. Strip away the theism, the critic says, and the whole structure collapses. No eternal lawgiver, therefore no eternal law, no guarantee that human reason tracks any moral order at all, which is left merely human preference dressed up in metaphysical robes. This challenge is more serious than the first, and the honest reply does not pretend the difficulty away. It is true that Aquinas grounded the natural law in God, but two things can be said. The first is that the natural law tradition has never depended on the whole of Thomist theology to do its work. Cicero grounded natural law in a divine reason pervading the cosmos. The Stoics grounded it in logos. Aquinas grounded it in the Christian God. Later thinkers grounded it in human nature as such, or in the bare requirements of practical reason. The tradition has proven remarkably portable across all these foundations, which strongly suggests that what is tracking is more robust than any single metaphysical scaffold built to explain it. And the second thing is that the alternative is nowhere near as comfortable as the critic supposes. A view that grounds rights in nothing but human preference has to accept that there is no preference-independent sense in which tyranny is wrong. That the torturer and his victim simply have distinct preferences, and that nothing but power decides between them. The intuition that some things are wrong, no matter what anyone prefers, is precisely the intuition the natural law tradition exists to articulate. You may reject the medieval explanation of that intuition and still owe the tradition a debt for having seen it clearly. The third objection is discontinuity. It grants that the medieval scholars said interesting things, but denies that there's any real thread connecting them to 1776. The line from Magna Carta to the Constitution, the critic argues, is a myth. A flattering story the 17th century English told themselves and that the Americans inherited, in which a continuous ancient constitution of immemorial liberty has always existed and merely needed reclaiming from usurping kings. But that continuity is invented. Coke's medievalism was bad history. The barons of 1215 had nothing to do with the merchants and lawyers of 1776. The golden thread on this account is an artifact of later myth-making, not a feature of the actual past. And the reply concedes the myth-making and denies that it is the whole story. And this matters for the entire series because the thread is our central image. Coke's history was indeed selective. The 17th century idea of an unbroken ancient constitution was in part a useful fiction. The series does not claim that a single self-conscious tradition of liberty marched in an unbroken line from Runnymede to Philadelphia, each generation consciously grasping at the hand of the last. The thread is not a chain like that. It is something looser and more interesting and more honest. It is the recurrence of certain ideas in different forms, in different centuries, as thinker after thinker facing the perennial problem of arbitrary power reached again and again for the same handful of solutions. The law above the king, the unjust law that does not bind, the authority that derives from the community. Sometimes those recurrences were connected by general textual transmission. Sometimes they were independent rediscovery. Neither makes the pattern an illusion. The founders really did read Coke. Coke really did read Bracton, and Bracton really did read that the king is under the law. The myth exaggerated the continuity. It did not invent the ideas. And ideas, once articulated, remain available to be found again. The thread is real. It is simply not a single strand. It is a braid. And some of its fibers were spun fresh in every generation that needed them. None of these three objections are frivolous. None of them, this series will keep arguing, defeats the case. The medieval centuries took an inheritance and made it operational. What had been philosophy in Athens and prophecy in Jerusalem and jurisprudence in Rome became, in the hands of schoolmen and lawyers, the working doctrine that the highest power on earth is not the highest authority, that above the king stands the law, and above the law stands a justice that no king made and no king may unmake. So let us once again apply the liberty test, a recurring tool. We're going to apply this to the heart of the episode. The liberty test asks a simple question: can a government rightly do a thing that no private individual among us could rightfully do? An individual may not seize his neighbor's person or take his neighbor's property except by some lawful and known process that his neighbor could also invoke. Clause 39 of the Magna Carta says that the king may not either, except by the judgment of peers or by the settled law of the land. That is the medieval inheritance speaking directly to our condition. So ask the hard, specific question. Where in your own society right now does government deprive individuals of their liberty or their property by process that no private individual could ever lawfully use? Civil asset forfeiture, where the state takes property without convicting anyone of a crime? Regulatory taking that no neighbor could impose? Detention and surveillance powers that belong to no private person? The medieval lawyers fought to bind the king to the law of the land. The question for us is whether we have let the lawmaker quietly become the king Bracton warned us about. Whether the law makes the king has quietly morphed into the lawmaker makes the law, which is the precise thing this whole inheritance was built to prevent. And take Aquinas' hardest gift, lex injusta non est lex, the unjust law that is no true law. He did not hand us a license to disobey whatever annoys us. He was careful, and we should be too. But he handed us something a free people cannot do without: the conviction that there is a standard above the statute. That when the lawmaker speaks, the question is not yet closed, that we may still ask whether what he has commanded conforms to the law above the law or violates it. A people that lose that conviction, that come to believe the statute is the final word simply because the sovereign issued it, has lost the very thing medieval centuries spent 300 years building. The whole point of higher law is that it gives you a place to stand when you tell power it has gone wrong. That is the medieval inheritance made present. We've reached the end of the first stage of the road. 4 weeks, 8 episodes, a part A and a part B, and 4 articles. And before we go on, I want to stand here on the summit with you and look back across the whole distance we have come, because this is the inheritance the founders received. And I really do not want you to think of it as a reading list. You need to think of it as the furniture in their minds, the air they breathed. It became a part of them. Not as books on a shelf, but as something internal, ingrained, a part of their being. Begin where we began. Athens gave them reason. The radical idea that the political order is not a mystery handed down by the gods, but a thing the human mind can study, classify, and improve. Athens gave them the mixed constitution, the insight that the way to restrain power is to divide it and set its parts against one another. And Athens gave them the conviction that political community exists for something, for the good life of the people who compose it, not for the glory of the man who rules it. Rome gave them natural law, Cicero's true law, right reason in agreement with nature, one eternal and unchangeable law valid for all nations and all times, that no Senate and no majority may repeal. Rome gave them the Republic, the working model of liberty under law. And Rome gave them the tragic knowledge of how the Republic dies. Not by a single blow, but by slow accommodation, until the forms remain and the substance is gone. Cicero died on the road to Forme so that the founders could learn that lesson without having to suffer it first. Jerusalem gave them covenant, the community constituted by consent rather than by force, which would surface again in the Mayflower Compact and at last in We the People. Jerusalem gave them the prophets who walked up to kings with no army and no office and told them to their faces that they stood under a higher law. And Jerusalem gave them Samuel's warning, the catalog of everything a king will take, ending in the word for slaves, the liberty test stated 3,000 years before we had a name for it. The house of wisdom gave them the inheritance itself, preserved and commented upon. For 500 years, when the Christian West lost its Aristotle, scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba and Cairo and Toledo bought the wisdom of the ancients by the ounce, argued over it for lifetimes, and carried it back across the gulf of language. Muslims and Jewish and Christian hands together so that there would be an inheritance left to receive at all. And the medieval forge today gave them the principles made operational. That the king is under the law, written in a meadow and stated as doctrine by Bracton. That law is discovered, not merely commanded, that there is a standard above the lawmaker. That an unjust law is no true law. That authority derives from the community is held in trust for its good. That the ruler who betrays the trust may be called to account. Now understand what I am telling you. The men who would meet in Philadelphia in 1776 and 1787 did not learn the things the way you might cram for an examination. They were raised on them. They read Cicero as boys and carried Plutarch into battle as men. They studied Hebrew at Harvard and Yale and Princeton. They knew their Coke, and through Coke, their Bracton. They argued about Aristotle's constitutions and Polybius' cycle the way we argue about current events. When John Adams sat down to defend the American constitutions, he reached for the Hebrew Republic and the Roman Republic and the medieval lawyers as easily as you would reach for something you have known your whole life. When Jefferson wrote that men are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights and grounded the whole Declaration in the laws of nature and nature's God, he was not inventing a philosophy. He was remembering one. He was writing down in the plainest words he could find the thing that 23 centuries of human striving had deposited into the marrow of his civilization. This is what an inheritance is. It is not what you are told. It is what you are made of. The thread ran from Athens to Jerusalem to Rome, nearly broke in the ruin of the West, but was carried to safety in Baghdad and handed home through Toledo, and was forged in the medieval centuries into doctrine hard enough to bind a king. 4 civilizations, 100 generations, countless men and women who never knew they were building anything, each one reaching, in their own moment of need, for the same few unkillable ideas. That there is law above the powerful. That the human person has a worth no ruler bestows and none may revoke. That authority is a trust, not a possession. No single people built this, no single faith, no single century, no single continent. It is the most human thing there is. The slow accumulation across the whole long story of our striving, the hard-won knowledge of what freedom requires. And it all came down to them, to a few thousand colonists on the edge of the known world who had inherited the whole of it, and who were about to do something with it that none of their teachers had quite dared. What we just described over these last 4 weeks is a hell of a foundation. But a foundation is not a house. Everything we have gathered in these 4 weeks is the foundation, and it is the most important thing about the building. And yet, it is not the building. The medieval synthesis established the principles. It did not establish the institutions, or the practice, or the willingness to bleed that would make those principles real against power. The doctrine that the king is under the law is one thing. A parliament willing to put a king on trial and cut off his head for denying it is another thing entirely. The principle that conscience answers to God above any earthly authority is one thing. A friar nailing his defiance to a church door and surviving to build a movement on it is another. The inheritance has been articulated. Now it would have to be fought for. The contemplative arc closes tonight. The militant arc begins. The men we have met so far worked at their desk. The philosopher, the prophet, the judge, the friar, the canon lawyer bent over his manuscript. The men who come next worked at the barricades. Next Saturday, in episode 5, this series turns to the Reformation and the firestorm of resistance it unleashed. To Martin Luther, standing before the emperor and refusing to recant, "Here I stand, I can do no other." To Calvinist theorists who took Aquinas' careful hedged account of resistance and forged it into a doctrine of lawful rebellion against tyrants. And to the Dutch, who built the first modern republic out of a revolt against the greatest empire of the age. The schoolmen laid down the foundation. Now we begin to build. And coming this Tuesday in our contemporary application episode, we take the medieval inheritance of this hour and hold it against our own moment. The higher law and the lawmaker who would be king, the unjust law and what we owe it. And the question Bracton left ringing down 8 centuries. Who, in a republic with no king, now stands in the place where law once stood above the crown? I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 4 of Self-Evident, The Road to 1776 on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you will find all written articles as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause, the New Leviathan, and the Empire of Liberty. The website has just been redesigned, so if you would take a look, let me know any comments that you might have. Connect to me on social media. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. You can find me on X at jkellick or on Facebook at Consequential Actions Podcast there as well. Happy to join you with any discussions and updates I may have. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Thank you again, and have a great day.